Chapter 32. Ariana, Point of View. I stared ahead of me, taking in the view. I was standing in front of my orphanage. But the question is, how? Why? I am in obsidian, aren't I? Suddenly, the door opened, and I watched as a brunette walked out. Her hair was braided to a side, and she wore a work uniform. Wait, that's me. I followed her down the road to the Mincy's kitchen. I remember this place clearly. It's where I had done my part-time during my high school. Good evening, the younger me shouted as the others returned the gesture. She then walked to the counter and took a notepad and pen, putting it on her pocket. The door to the cafe jingled as it met with the bell. Inside walked a guy with a scarf covering his lower face. He also wore a hat and a long coat, even though it was burning hot summer. His eyes, though, were a familiar blue, and I grasped when I recognized that it was Alistair. The younger me smiled and walked to him, talking her notepad out. "The usual, sir?" she asked cheerfully as he nodded. From the way he was squinting his eyes, I could tell he was smiling. The younger me walked to the counter and prepared his food. So Alistair came to my cafe during my part-times. I watched as his eyes always stayed on her as she blindly worked on the cafe. He didn't talk to her, but he gave her a rather huge tip before he left. The scene changed, and I was once again in the cafe. It was snowing now, and I saw him enter while the young me was in her morning shift. The cafe was not as busy as the last time, and there were only a few customers here and there. "Hello, sir. The usual?" she asked, the same dialogue as he nodded with his smile. Once again, I watched as he kept staring at her, working in the cafe. But I noticed she had her textbook open. Oh, the winter break exams. I was preparing for the entrance. Once she served him his food, she took her text and walked to the counter. She sat on the worker side and started to study as he still kept observing her. I must say, Alistair has the nerve to stare at me, irrespective of being so damn obvious. And here I am, oblivious to everything. "You know, that guy is staring at you, right?" Mia, my coworker, said as young Arya looked up from her textbook. She raised her eyes confusingly as Mia pointed to his table with her eyes. I saw the younger me hold in the breath when she saw him staring. He didn't move his eyes away and kept staring, and I saw a blush form on her face as she finally looked away, coughing. Once he finished his food, she walked to him with the bill. "Your bill, sir," she said, putting the bill down on his table. He quickly fished out the money, and once again, it was included with a huge tip.
"I hope you will do well in your exam,"
he said, his voice soothing. "Thank you," she said, trying to cover her blush with her hand. He smiled and bowed down at her as her eyes widened in shock. Then he walked out of the cafe, her eyes following him till he was out of sight. Poor me. I guess I was wondering why he bowed down at me. The younger me was ignorant he was the future king to the wizards and still follow old court life. "I told you he has the hots for you," Mia said as she slapped the young Arya's back. She winced in pain and rubbed her shoulder as Mia smiled guiltily at her. "I don't know," she said as Mia rolled her eyes. "You're kidding, right? He only visits this place in January and April, and that too, 5 days. And all the time he visits the exact time of your shift. Don't tell me it's coincidence, 'cause it's clearly not," she said, sassily putting her hand on her hips. "You think he's a stalker?" young Arya asked, clearly amused by her observation. "Well, who knows? Too bad we have never seen his face. He always has a scarf and a cap. He grabs too much attention with his appearance, too," she said, as the latter nodded, agreeing. Alistair was in a weird, noticeable dress, and his way of covering his identity makes people misinterprets him to be some serial killer. Suddenly, the screen around me blurred, and I was standing in the freezing cold. I was only wearing a thin dress, and I shivered at the overwhelming cold. Why does the cold in a vision have to affect me? I suddenly froze as I saw the younger me run fast down the alley. Behind her was a few guys all laughing and commenting vulgarly.
"Come on, beautiful. Don't run away from us. We won't hurt you,"
one of them said as they followed her. I followed the younger me, trying my best to use my powers on those thugs. I cursed as nothing came out of my hands. The younger me turned into an alley, as did the men. I cursed as I saw that it was a dead end. The young Arya had her back against the wall as she looked at the men with fear.
"Looks like it is a dead end, beautiful,"
one of them said, walking forward. He stopped a few inches away from her and smirked before forcing his body against hers. "Stop!" she screamed and cried, but he only laughed.
"Your cries make it sound even more fucking sexy,"
he growled in her ears. Tears fell down of my eyes, and I prayed for someone to save the young me. As if my prayer has been answered, a growl erupted behind me. Shocked, I turned around to watch Alistair glaring at the men.
"What do you think you're doing?"
He growled out, his voice filled with venom. "Help!" I heard the younger me croaked out. As though something snapped at him, he ran to the men. He fought the 5 men, and within seconds, they were all unconscious. "Ah!" I heard a scream, and I turned to look at the younger Arya. The man who was holding her now stood behind her with a gun pointed to her head.
"Try coming closer, and she is dead,"
he said as Alistair growled. but stood still.
Let her go.
He said, as the other smirked.
Too pretty to go without fulfilling my wishes, don't you think?
He said, as Alistair let out another growl. He ran to the man, and the man was surprised for a second before he raised the gun at Alistair. Ah! The both of me screamed as the trigger was pulled. Alistair fell on the floor with a thud as the bullet went through his stomach. The man pushed the younger me to the ground and walked to a very still laying Alistair.
Don't mess with me,
He said, kicking Alistair in the stomach. But a suddenly turn of event happened as Alistair grabbed the man by his leg, making him fall. He then jumped on top of the man, on the process grabbing his gun. He hit the man unconscious with the gun before swaying his way to the younger me. She, on the other hand, was by the corner, her head hidden in her hands. She was clearly crying and shivering. Alistair took his coat and put it over her.
Are you all right, Ariana?
He asked as she looked up at him. How did you know my name? She asked, looking up at his eyes. He smiled down at her, and as if something dawned at her, I grasped. The man in the coffee shop, she shouted as he smiled and nodded.
My name is Alistair, beautiful. It is a pleasure to see you outside your work. Although it would be lovely if we met under different circumstances.
He said, wincing at the end. You're bleeding, the younger me grasped as I looked down at his stomach. Blood was staining his white shirt, and it seems to be spreading more and more.
I'm okay.
He grasped out, but was still swaying. He finally fell limp on her as she screamed his name. Alistair!